Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the lore they never wanted you to know.
I still remember the color of the sky before they came, a dull gray that pressed down on our hive city like a lid on a coffin, thick with industrial smog and the ash of 10,000 manufactorums burning their offerings to the god emperor's endless appetite for production. The air tasted of metal and chemicals, but it was our air, the air of Vortan III, a forge world that had served the Imperium faithfully for 6,000 years. We made ammunition there, billions of rounds every day, stamped with the Aquila and blessed by tech priests who chanted the litany of proper function over conveyor belts that never stopped moving. I was a shift supervisor in Manufactorum 79 Delta, overseeing 300 workers who loaded shells into assembly machines, and I believed with absolute certainty that our world was protected by the Emperor's grace and the Imperial Navy's eternal vigilance. I believed many things in those days, back when belief meant something other than the bitter joke it became. The first sign came through the Vox networks 3 weeks before the invasion, garbled transmissions from our system's outer monitoring stations, strange readings on auger arrays, ships appearing at the edge of sensor range that didn't match any known Imperial or registered trader configurations. The administratum officials dismissed it as equipment malfunction or perhaps smugglers testing our defenses. The Planetary Defense Force was placed on low alert, which meant absolutely nothing changed, except more prayers were added to the shift change rituals, and the PDF troopers spent slightly more time checking their lasguns. Life continued as it always had: 16-hour shifts, mandatory prayer sessions, ration distributions, the endless grinding rhythm of industrial production that was the only reality we'd ever known. I had a wife named Mira and a daughter named Kisa, 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and a smile that could briefly make me forget the taste of recycled air and the constant ache in my back from years of standing on factory floors. We lived in Hab Block 97, Level 42, a compartment 8 meters by 5 meters that housed our family and 2 other workers from my manufactorum. Privacy was a concept for the administratum classes in their upper hive spires. We slept in shifts, ate our Nutri-Paste rations while standing because there wasn't room for a proper table, and thanked the Emperor daily for the privilege of existence in his service. I'm telling you this so you understand that our lives were already grim, already stripped of comfort or dignity, already reduced to mere survival and service. What came after made those days seem like paradise. The invasion began at dawn on the 147th day of the year, though dawn on Vortan III was just a slight lessening of the artificial lights that illuminated our perpetual industrial twilight. I was on shift when the sirens started. Not the normal shift change bells or production alerts, but the emergency klaxons that hadn't sounded since my grandfather's time when raiders had attacked a cargo convoy in high orbit. The Vox system crackled with panicked voices, overlapping orders and counter-orders, someone screaming about green-skinned Xenos and massive orbital assault, before the transmission cut to static. The floor supervisor ordered us to remain at our stations and continue production because ammunition would be needed for the defense, so we stood there, loading shells, while the world ended around us, and the ground began to shake with impacts that made the walls crack and dust rain down from the ceiling. The orbital bombardment lasted for 6 hours. Not precise lance strikes or surgical torpedo attacks, but crude kinetic bombardment, asteroids and scrap metal, and Emperor knows what else dropped from orbit to impact the planet's surface with the force of atomic weapons. They hit the PDF fortifications first, the anti-orbital battery emplacements that ringed our primary hive, turning them into craters of molten slag and vaporized defenders. Then they hit the spaceport, the administratum complexes, the power generation facilities, anything that looked important or impressive or simply anything at all. The impacts rolled across the planet's surface like the footsteps of gods, each one a thunderclap that rattled our bones and made our ears bleed, each one closer than the last until finally one struck Hab Block 94, 3 blocks from ours, and killed everyone inside in a blast that turned the entire structure into a pillar of fire that burned for 2 days. I ran from my manufactorum when the impacts got close enough to crack the foundation, abandoning my post and my duty, and all the imperial conditioning that insisted my life meant nothing compared to the sacred production quotas. I ran through streets clogged with panicked civilians, past PDF troopers who'd thrown down their lasguns and stripped off their uniforms, past burning buildings and bodies crushed under falling debris, and people simply sitting in the streets, staring at nothing with empty eyes because their minds had broken under the weight of sudden catastrophe. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the smell of burning promethium, and the sky was full of them. Ork landing craft, if you could call them that. They looked like meteors, like falling stars, like chunks of scrap metal held together by nothing but gravity, and perhaps the collective belief of the creatures inside them that they should fly. Hundreds of them, thousands, streaming down through the atmosphere, trailing fire and smoke, crashing into the planet's surface, or sometimes simply disintegrating in mid-air and showering the ground below with wreckage and bodies that didn't seem to care that they'd just fallen from orbit without proper protection. They hit the ground and the doors burst open if there were doors. Sometimes it was just the whole craft splitting apart, and they came pouring out, green and massive and roaring with a sound that bypassed your ears and went straight into your chest, your gut, your bones. I'd seen picked captures of orcs in the administratum propaganda reels, educational materials meant to instill proper hatred of Xenos in the Imperium's citizens. But those sanitized images, those carefully censored recordings, conveyed nothing of the reality. Orcs are large, 2.5 meters tall, some even larger, masses of green muscle and scar tissue, and crude cybernetic augmentation, held together by biology that shouldn't work but does. They wear armor made from scrap metal and rust, and what looks like it should fall apart but doesn't. They carry weapons that are blocks of iron and crude mechanical components that should explode in their wielders' hands, but instead spray bullets or flames or crackling energy with devastating effect. And they make noise constant, overwhelming noise, a mixture of mechanical roaring and guttural bellowing and what might have been language if language could be screamed at volumes that made your ears bleed. I made it to Hab Block 97 through sheer desperate momentum, climbing over rubble and through gaps in collapsed walls, ignoring the screams and the sounds of weapons fire that echoed through the hive's corridors like thunder in a canyon. Our compartment was untouched, miraculously intact while the blocks around it burned or collapsed, and there was Mera with Kisa clutched against her chest, both of them alive, both of them terrified, staring at me with eyes that begged me to protect them, to save them, to do something that would make this nightmare end. I grabbed what supplies we had: 2 days of ration bars, a flask of recycled water, a stub pistol I'd purchased from a black market dealer years ago against regulations, and told them we had to run, had to get to the lower hive levels, had to hide until the Imperial Navy arrived and drove the Xenos back into the void where they belonged. We ran. Thousands of us, tens of thousands, flooding through the hive's arterial corridors and accessways, a river of desperate humanity flowing downward into the bowels of the city, away from the surface where death fell from the sky, and green-skinned monsters killed everything they encountered. The orcs were behind us, above us, their weapons creating a constant background roar of destruction, their voices raised in something that might have been war cries or might have been laughter. I couldn't tell the difference, and I'm not sure there was one. We saw them catch other fleeing civilians, saw what happened to those who were too slow or too tired or simply unlucky, and I won't describe that here because some images can't be adequately conveyed with words, and perhaps shouldn't be. I pulled Kisa's face against my chest so she couldn't see, felt Mera's hand gripping mine hard enough to leave bruises, and we kept running because stopping meant dying and dying meant failing the only 2 people in the universe who mattered to me. The lower hive was a maze of ancient corridors and forgotten chambers, levels that had been built and abandoned and built over again across 6,000 years of industrial expansion, now inhabited by gangs and mutants and people who'd fallen through the cracks of imperial society and made their homes in the dark. We found a chamber 3 levels below the main hive structure, part of what had once been a water reclamation facility, long since dried up and abandoned, accessible only through a maintenance shaft so narrow we had to crawl. There were others there already, maybe 40 people huddled in the darkness, speaking in whispers, trying to make sense of what had happened, waiting for news that the Imperial Navy had arrived and was purging the Xenos from our world. Days passed in that chamber, maybe a week. Time became difficult to track without the manufactorum bells to mark the shifts. We rationed our food carefully, sent scouts up to higher levels to search for supplies and information, listened to the sounds of battle echoing through the hive's metal bones, weapons, fire, explosions, screaming, and above it all that constant orc roaring that seemed to shake the very walls. The scouts who went up sometimes came back with food scavenged from abandoned hab blocks or news gleaned from other survivor groups. More often, they didn't come back at all. The news, when it came, was worse than anything we'd imagined. The PDF had been routed within the first day, their fortifications destroyed, their command structure decapitated by precision strikes that suggested the Orks weren't quite as crude as Imperial propaganda claimed. The Imperial Navy vessels that had been in system had attempted to engage the Ork fleet and been overwhelmed by sheer numbers for every Imperial ship. There were dozens of Ork vessels, and while individually they were inferior, collectively they were a swarm that couldn't be stopped. The Navy had withdrawn to regroup. That was the official story. The reality was, they'd fled, jumped into the warp and abandoned us to our fate, because sacrificing one forge world to preserve the fleet was sound military doctrine, and individual lives never entered into strategic calculations. We were alone. Millions of Imperial citizens on a planet that had just been taken by Xenos, with no rescue coming, no salvation on the horizon, nothing but the terrible certainty that our world now belonged to the Orks and we existed only at their sufferance. Some people in our refugee group broke mentally at that news, curling into fetal positions and refusing to move or speak or acknowledge reality. Others became angry, swearing they'd fight to the last, that they'd make the Xenos pay for every meter of Imperial soil they'd taken. I just held my family and tried not to think about what happened to Imperial citizens living under Xenos occupation, because the Administratum education reels had been very clear that such occupation was impossible. The Orks killed everything, took no slaves, left nothing but devastation and corpses. But that wasn't quite true. We learned this slowly, pieced it together from refugee reports and our own cautious observations over the following weeks. The Orks had taken the planet, yes, but they hadn't killed everyone. They'd killed the PDF and the Administratum officials, and anyone who'd fought back, killed them enthusiastically and violently, and displayed the bodies in ways meant to serve as warnings or trophies or perhaps just decoration. But the general population, the workers and the families and the countless civilians who'd had no part in the planet's defense, they were being rounded up, herded into designated zones, put to work. The Orks, it turned out, had use for slaves. Not in the organized, systematic way that Imperial penal colonies had use for convicts, but in the chaotic, pragmatic way that creatures who were always building and fighting and expanding needed labor to do the tasks they found boring or beneath them. They were turning our forge world into something else, something I couldn't quite comprehend from the fragmentary reports we received. They were stripping the manufactorums for raw materials, tearing down buildings to construct their own structures, converting our industrial infrastructure into whatever passed for Ork civilization. We stayed hidden for 3 weeks before hunger drove us out. The ration bars were long gone. We'd been drinking water that leaked through the hive's ancient pipes and tasted of rust and chemicals. And Kisa was getting sick, her skin pale and her eyes fevered. I had to find food, had to risk going up to the higher levels where the Orks were operating, had to do something other than wait in the darkness for my daughter to die of starvation or disease. Mera begged me not to go, but she knew as well as I did that there was no choice, that staying meant death, just as surely as leaving, only slower and more cruel. The hive had been transformed in those 3 weeks. The Orks had been busy, impossibly busy, and what they'd accomplished in such a short time defied logic and engineering principles and every natural law I understood. They'd torn out entire sections of the upper hive, ripped away the Gothic imperial architecture, and replaced it with their own crude structures, towers of scrap metal and reinforced scrap that somehow stood despite looking like they should collapse under their own weight, workshops that belched smoke and flame from a dozen openings, vast open areas that might have been gathering places or fighting pits, or simply clearing where they could move their vehicles and war machines. The Orks themselves were everywhere, moving with purpose through the transformed city, hauling materials or working on construction projects or brawling with each other in fights that seemed to be recreational rather than genuinely hostile. And among them, dwarfed and terrified, were humans. Imperial citizens from my world, now reduced to slave labor, carrying loads or operating machinery or performing tasks under the casual supervision of Ork overseers who would occasionally strike a worker with a massive fist if they moved too slowly or made a mistake. I watched from a concealed position in a ruined building, my heart hammering, my mind trying to process the impossible sight of my people, the Emperor's people serving Xenos masters. They didn't look tortured, exactly. They looked exhausted, malnourished, covered in bruises and cuts, moving with the careful slowness of people who'd learned that sudden movements attracted violent attention. But they were alive, functioning, being fed enough to remain useful. The Orks weren't preserving them out of mercy or any recognition of their humanity. They were maintaining useful tools, nothing more. But in the grim calculus of survival, that meant they would live as long as they could work. I stole food from an Ork supply dump that night, sacks of some kind of fungus that grew in vast cultivated patches throughout the occupied hive, tough and bitter but edible, nutritious enough to keep humans alive if not exactly healthy. I also stole knowledge. Watching the patterns of Ork movement, learning which areas were heavily trafficked and which were relatively empty, understanding that the occupation had a structure even if it was a crude one, and that structure meant opportunities for survival if you were clever and desperate enough to exploit them. I brought the food back to our hiding place, enough for several days, and I told Mera and the others what I'd seen. Some of them were horrified at the thought of survival meaning submission to Xenos rule. Others, the pragmatists, understood that we had no other options. The Imperium wasn't coming to save us. The planet was lost. Our only choice was death or adaptation, and adaptation meant accepting our new reality as slave labor in an Ork-occupied forge world that was rapidly becoming something the Imperium would never recognize as human. Over the following months, I think it was months, though time became fluid in ways I can't adequately explain, more survivors emerged from hiding and were absorbed into the Ork labor system. It wasn't organized in any imperial sense. No proper registration or documentation or hierarchy. The Orks simply grabbed you if they found you, assessed whether you could work, and put you to a task. If you did the work adequately, they fed you usually that same bitter fungus, sometimes scraps of meat from sources I learned not to examine too closely. If you couldn't work or refused to work, they killed you, though usually they seemed more annoyed than angry about it, the way you might be annoyed at a tool that broke. I ended up working in what had once been Manufactorum 79 Delta, my own workplace, though it was unrecognizable now. The Orks had torn out all the precision imperial machinery and replaced it with their own equipment, crude presses and forges and assembly lines that operated on principles that shouldn't work but somehow produced functioning weapons, and armor and vehicle components. My job was loading scrap metal into a massive furnace that melted everything down into base materials that could be reformed into whatever the Orks needed. It was hot, dangerous work, the furnace radiating heat that made breathing difficult and caused burns if you got too close. But it was work I could do, and doing it meant survival. Mera was assigned to one of the fungus cultivation chambers, tending the vast crops that grew in what had been residential hab blocks, the entire structures converted into humid growing environments that stank of decay and earth and something else, something that was distinctly Ork. Kisa was put with the other children in a kind of communal care facility, not out of any Ork compassion, but because keeping the children alive and relatively healthy meant the adult workers remained more compliant and productive. The Orks had figured out that humans worked better when their families were alive, so they maintained the families as a practical matter of labor management. The Ork overseers at my furnace were brutal but not randomly cruel. They'd strike you if you were too slow or made mistakes, but they didn't torture or kill for entertainment. They communicated primarily through bellowing and pointing, and occasionally hitting you to emphasize a point. But over time, I learned to understand their expectations. They wanted the furnace fed constantly, wanted the metal melted down efficiently, wanted the output maximized. Achieve that, and they'd leave you alone. Fail, and you'd be beaten. Or if you failed consistently enough, you'd be replaced by someone more capable, and your corpse would be fed into the furnace along with the scrap metal. I learned things about Orks during those months of slave labor, things the Administratum education reels had never mentioned and perhaps didn't know. They weren't mindless savages, though they were savage. They had a society, a culture, a way of organizing themselves that was fundamentally alien, but possessed its own internal logic. Bigger Orks commanded smaller Orks through a combination of physical dominance and what seemed like an instinctive respect for power. They built things not from engineering knowledge, but from some intuitive understanding of how things should work. And incredibly, impossibly, their constructions functioned despite violating every principle of physics and mechanics. They fought constantly among themselves, but the fights had rules, unspoken rules, but rules nonetheless, and the fights seemed to serve as entertainment and hierarchy, enforcement and social bonding all at once, and they grew. I saw this personally. Orks that started out the size of large humans, gradually getting larger over the months, their bodies responding to the violence and conflict that was their constant environment by becoming bigger and stronger. The boss of our work gang, a creature they called Bonacrucia. I never learned if that was a name or a title or just a description, was perhaps 3 meters tall, massively muscled, covered in scars, and crude cybernetic augmentations that clicked and whirred with every movement. He'd killed dozens of challengers for his position, their skulls incorporated into his armor as trophies, and the other Orks treated him with a deference that was the closest thing to respect I'd seen among them. The planet was being transformed wholesale. Where there had been Imperial manufactorums, there were now Ork workshops producing weapons and vehicles in quantities that suggested they were preparing for another campaign, another invasion, using our world as a staging ground for further conquest. Where there had been residential hab blocks, there were now fungus farms and fighting pits and vast garages housing crude trucks and battle wagons and walking war machines that stood 30 meters tall and bristled with weapons. The orbital shipyards, which had once produced ammunition transport vessels for the Imperial Navy, were now turning out Ork spacecraft, ungainly masses of metal and engines that shouldn't be capable of atmospheric escape, much less interstellar travel, but which took off regularly in great roaring launches that shook the ground for kilometers around. I saw the extent of the transformation one day when Bonacrucia decided our work gang would be reassigned to a construction project on the planet's surface. They loaded us into the back of a truck. 40 human slaves packed into a cargo bed designed for maybe 20. Standing room only, breathing the exhaust fumes that poured from the vehicle's crude engine and drove us out of the hive city into what had been Vortan 3's industrial wastes. The landscape was unrecognizable. Where there had been toxic ash plains and slag heaps, there was now green. Not natural green, not grass or trees, but Ork green, vast fields of fungus growing in organized rows, some kind of rapid biological transformation of the planetary surface that was turning our dead industrial world into something alive in a way that was fundamentally wrong and alien. And among the fungus fields were Orks. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, maybe more. Not just the warriors we'd been dealing with, but smaller Orks, weaker Orks, Orks that seemed to be at different developmental stages. They were growing from the fungus itself, I realized with a horror that went beyond fear into some new territory of understanding. The orcs reproduced through spores, some kind of biological process that used their dead as seeds for new growth. And they were seeding our entire world with themselves, turning it into an orc planet that would continue producing more orcs long after the current generation had left for new conquests. The construction project was a fortress, a massive structure of metal and stone and concrete being erected in the middle of the fungus fields, towers and walls and gates that would make it defensible against whatever threats the orcs anticipated. We humans were there to do the labor the orcs found tedious, mixing concrete, hauling materials, operating the simpler machinery. The work was backbreaking, carried out under the planet's harsh sun that we lower hive workers had rarely seen before the invasion. The heat different from the furnace heat I'd grown accustomed to, more oppressive somehow, beating down from above while the ground radiated back the stored warmth and left us cooking from both directions. People died during that construction project, heat exhaustion, industrial accidents, simply working until their bodies gave out and they collapsed and never got up again. The orcs would check if a fallen worker was dead, and if so, they'd toss the corpse into a pile that was periodically loaded onto a truck and taken away to be processed into something food for the fungus, maybe, or raw materials for some other orc industry. If the fallen worker was merely unconscious or injured, the orcs would dump water on them and beat them until they either got up and went back to work or died from the beating, at which point they'd join the corpse pile. There was no medical care, no rest for the sick or injured, no accommodation for human weakness. You worked or you died, and the orcs didn't care which, as long as the construction project continued. Kisa got sick during this period, some infection that spread through the children's communal facility, and there was nothing I could do for her. No medicine available, no way to get her proper treatment. I held her during my sleep periods, felt her body burning with fever, listened to her cough that sounded wet and wrong, and prayed to the Emperor with a fervor I hadn't felt since childhood, begging him to spare her, to protect her, to remember his faithful servant on this lost world. My prayers went unanswered. She died on a morning when the sky was clear and the sun was bright, and the orc work gangs were preparing for another day of construction. And I was expected at my labor assignment, so I placed her small body in the corpse pile with the others and went to work, because grieving was a luxury I couldn't afford, and stopping meant I'd die too, which would leave Mera alone in this nightmare. Something broke in me that day, some last connection to my humanity or hope or faith in the Emperor's plan. I became mechanical, performing my tasks with the mindless efficiency of a servitor, shutting down everything except the bare minimum of consciousness needed to follow orders and avoid being killed. Mera retreated similarly into herself, her eyes going hollow and distant, her movements purely functional. We existed without living, moved without purpose beyond continued motion, endured without any belief that endurance would lead anywhere except more of the same. Months became years, though the delineation was increasingly meaningless. The Orks' transformation of Vorten 3 continued, accelerated even, the entire planet becoming a massive Ork stronghold and production facility. More Orks arrived, ship after ship descending from orbit, some of them different varieties smaller, more clever ones that seemed to serve as mechanics and engineers, or larger, more brutal ones that appeared to be elite warriors, or occasionally genuinely massive ones that the others treated with something approaching reverence and fear. The human slave population fluctuated as people died, and new captives were brought from Emperor knows where, other worlds the Orks had conquered, all of us reduced to the same level of misery and servitude, regardless of our origins. The thing about slavery under Orks is that it strips away all the comforting lies the Imperium tells about hierarchy and purpose and service. There's no pretense that your suffering is glorious or meaningful. The Orks don't claim they're saving your soul or preserving humanity or serving some greater cosmic purpose. They simply use you until you break, and then they replace you with someone else, And the honesty of that transaction is somehow worse than the Imperium's elaborate justifications for why you should be grateful to die in a manufactorum at 35. At least the Orks don't pretend they care about your spiritual welfare while they work you to death. I was in my 4th year of servitude when the Imperial Liberation Force arrived. I use the word liberation loosely, you understand, because what happened next made the Ork occupation seem almost merciful by comparison. The Imperial Navy returned with a fleet, plus several regiments of Imperial Guard, plus a detachment of Space Marines from one of the chapters whose names I didn't catch and wouldn't repeat if I had. They announced their arrival by bombarding the orbital Ork facilities, then began landing ground forces to reclaim the planet in the Emperor's name. The Orks responded with enthusiasm, treating the Imperial invasion as the greatest entertainment they'd had in years. They abandoned the construction projects and industrial work, gathered their weapons and vehicles, and surged to meet the Imperial forces in battles that shook the planet's surface and lit the sky with fires that burned day and night. The human slaves were forgotten in this chaos, suddenly irrelevant to both sides, and that irrelevance became a different kind of danger, because now we were simply obstacles between two armies that cared nothing for our survival. The Imperial Guards swept through the Ork-held territories with flamer and bolter, purging Xenos with righteous fury and absolute prejudice. They also purged anything that looked like it might be tainted by Xenos contact, which included the fungus fields and the Ork structures, and, inevitably, the human slaves who'd been living and working under Ork rule for 4 years. The Commissariat's position was clear. Anyone who'd survived this long under Xenos occupation was suspect, possibly tainted by prolonged exposure to alien influence, and the safest course was to purge first and sort out loyalties in the Emperor's judgment after death. I watched guard troopers execute groups of freed slaves, lining them up against walls and shooting them while priests chanted prayers of purification. I watched flamers turned on camps of survivors, burning them alive while officers shouted about the necessity of cleansing Xenos corruption. I watched orbital bombardment called down on residential areas that still held human populations, because Orks were using those areas as cover, and acceptable losses were calculated in terms that didn't distinguish between Xenos and Imperial citizens. The liberation of Vortan 3 was killing more humans than the Ork occupation had. Mera died in that liberation, caught in a building when the guard called an artillery strike on an Ork position nearby. The building collapsed, crushed under tons of rubble, and I dug through it with my bare hands until my fingers bled but never found her body. Maybe she survived and was executed as a collaborator by some zealous commissar. Maybe she was captured by fleeing Orks and taken off-world. Maybe she's still alive somewhere. Though I've learned not to hope for that because hope is just another way of torturing yourself. I survived through a combination of luck and instinct, fleeing from both the Orks and the Imperials, hiding in the same lower hive chambers where this nightmare had begun. The battle raged for weeks, the Orks fighting with savage joy, the Imperials prosecuting their liberation with systematic brutality, both sides turning the planet into a graveyard. Eventually the Imperium won, though won is perhaps too strong a word for what happened. They drove the Orks off planet, though not before the Xenos managed to evacuate a substantial portion of their forces and equipment. They reclaimed Vortan 3's orbital space, though the shipyards were ruined and the orbital infrastructure was decades away from being rebuilt. They planted the Aquila flag on the planet's surface and declared it once again an imperial world, though the surface was a wasteland and the hive cities were gutted shells, and they began processing the survivors. Every human found on Vortan 3 was subjected to interrogation, examination, loyalty testing, genetic screening, psychological evaluation, spiritual assessment. The Inquisition was involved. I saw their agents moving through the temporary processing camps, and where the Inquisition goes, mercy goes to die. Some survivors were cleared after weeks of testing and allowed to return to whatever fragments of their old lives remained. More were declared tainted or suspect and transferred to penal colonies to serve out sentences of indeterminate length. A substantial number were simply executed as proven traitors or heretics or Xenos collaborators. their confessions extracted through methods that made the Ork work gangs seem gentle. I was cleared. Eventually, after 3 months of interrogation and testing that I won't describe in detail because the Inquisition's methods are not things to be spoken of lightly, they determined I had been a loyal imperial citizen forced into servitude by circumstances beyond my control, that my faith in the Emperor remained intact despite the horrors I'd witnessed, that I showed no signs of genetic or spiritual corruption from prolonged Xenos exposure. They gave me a certificate of clearance, assigned me a new work placement, and told me I should be grateful for the Emperor's mercy in preserving my life and soul. I was sent to another forge world, another manufactorum, another existence of 16-hour shifts and nutri-paste rations and hab blocks shared with strangers. The work was familiar loading shells into assembly machines, the same task I'd performed before the invasion, as if the years of Ork occupation had been a brief interruption rather than the complete destruction of everything I'd known and loved. I went through the motions, recited the prayers, followed the regulations, and slowly came to understand that nothing had changed and nothing would ever change, because this was the Imperium, and the Imperium was eternal, and individual suffering was meaningless in the vast calculus of humanity's survival. Years have passed since Vortan 3. I'm older now, my body bearing the scars of radiation exposure and hard labor and the casual violence of 2 different forms of slavery, because that's what it was, slavery under the Orks and slavery under the Imperium, and the primary difference was that the Imperium told prettier lies about why your suffering mattered. I have no family, no connections, no purpose beyond continued function in service to a machine that will grind on long after I'm dead and forgotten. I work my shifts, collect my rations, sleep in my assigned quarters, and wait for my body to fail, or an industrial accident to kill me, or simple exhaustion to stop my heart. Sometimes I think about Vortan 3 as it was when the Orks took it. The vast fungus fields turning our dead world green. The Ork workshops producing weapons and vehicles at impossible rates. The crude vitality of creatures that lived without the Imperium's suffocating dogma and bureaucratic oppression. I'm not saying the Orks were better. They were brutal, savage, killed casually, and cared nothing for human life. But they were honest about what they were and what they wanted, and there was something almost refreshing in that honesty, compared to the Imperium's elaborate pretense that our suffering is glorious and our deaths are meaningful. The truth that the Imperium doesn't want its citizens to know is that Xenos occupation might be brutal, but it's not necessarily worse than Imperial rule, just different in its brutality. The Orks worked us until we died, but so does the Imperium. The Orks fed us enough to remain functional, but so does the Imperium. The Orks killed those who couldn't work or became inconvenient, but so does the Imperium. The primary difference was that the Orks never pretended they were doing it for our own good, never claimed they were saving our souls while destroying our bodies, never wrapped their cruelty in prayers and piety, and the assertion that the God Emperor blessed our suffering. I know these thoughts are heresy. I know that acknowledging them, even in the privacy of my own mind, makes me guilty of treason against the Imperium and the Emperor's divine plan for humanity. I know that if the confessors could read these words, they'd have me executed or lobotomized into a servitor, and perhaps that would be mercy. But I can't unknow what I learned on Vortan 3, can't unsee the fundamental truth that slavery is slavery regardless of whether your master is green-skinned and honest or human and hypocritical. What happens when Orks take a planet? They strip it for resources, transform it into a staging ground for further conquests, work its population to death in service of their endless war against everyone and everything. What happens when the Imperium reclaims a planet from Orks? Exactly the same thing, just with more prayers and purer rhetoric and an absolute certainty that this slavery is holy while the other was profane. The end result is identical human suffering in service to powers that view us as nothing more than expendable resources. Our lives measured only by our utility, our deaths noted only in logistics reports calculating replacement costs. I'm writing this not literally. I have neither paper nor privacy for actual writing, but composing it in my mind, preserving it in memory because memory is all I have left, because someone should bear witness to what happened on Vortan 3rd. Someone should remember that millions of Imperial citizens survived Ork occupation only to be purged by their own Imperium. That families were destroyed not by Xenos but by the liberation force that claimed to be saving them. That the difference between Ork brutality and Imperial mercy is so thin as to be non-existent when viewed from the perspective of those being brutalized. The Administratum won't record these truths. The official histories will say that Vortan 3 was occupied by Xenos, liberated by the Emperor's faithful servants, and returned to productive Imperial service with acceptable losses and minimal complications. The survivors will be statistical data in reports, numbers in columns adding up to an acceptable cost for a successful military operation. Our suffering will be justified as necessary sacrifice, our deaths blessed as martyrdom, our trauma dismissed as the predictable consequence of Xenos contact requiring spiritual cleansing. But I was there. I saw what happened when Orks took a planet, and what happened when the Imperium took it back. I watched my daughter die from disease contracted in an Ork labor camp, and I watched my wife die from Imperial artillery fire that made no distinction between Xenos and civilians. I survived both occupations and learned that the Imperium's claim to moral superiority over the Xenos is the greatest lie it tells, because at least the Orks never claimed to love us while they worked us to death. This is what happens when Orks take a planet in the 41st millennium. The population suffers under brutal occupation, working as slaves in service of alien conquerors who care nothing for human life or dignity. This is what happens when the Imperium liberates that planet. The population suffers under brutal purification, dying in the crossfire, or executed as suspected collaborators by liberators who care nothing for human life or dignity beyond its utility to the Imperial war machine. The Xenos and the Imperium are both monsters, just wearing different faces, and we who live under their rule are nothing but meat to be ground up and consumed in their eternal conflicts. I know the Emperor protects. They tell us this constantly. Make us chant it during our prayers, inscribe it on walls and equipment, and our own bodies through tattoos and brands. But the Emperor didn't protect Vortan 3 from the Orks. He didn't protect the millions who died in the occupation, or the tens of thousands more who died in the liberation. He didn't protect Kisa or Mera, or any of the people I knew who were consumed by forces beyond their control or understanding. The Emperor protects the Imperium, perhaps, preserves the great machine of human empire that spans the galaxy and grinds on eternally. But the Emperor doesn't protect individual humans, doesn't care about our small lives and smaller deaths, doesn't notice when we're enslaved by Orks, or purged by Inquisitors, or simply worked to death in manufactorums, producing ammunition for wars we'll never see, fighting enemies we'll never meet. I continue to exist because the alternative is death, and some stubborn part of me refuses to grant the universe that victory. Refuses to stop just because stopping would be easier. I work my shifts and mouth my prayers and maintain the pretense of loyal Imperial citizenship, all while knowing that the Imperium is just as monstrous as the Xenos it claims to protect us from, just more hypocritical about its monstrosity. I endure because endurance is all I have left, because bearing witness to the truth is the only form of resistance available to someone as powerless as me. This is the real horror of the 41st millennium, the truth beneath all the propaganda and piety. There are no good options for ordinary humans caught between the Imperium's grinding machinery and the endless threats that assail humanity from all sides. We are expendable, replaceable, meaningless except in aggregate, and whether we die serving the Emperor, or serving Xenos masters, or simply serving the uncaring forces of entropy and decay, the result is the same. We suffer, we die, we're forgotten, and the great machine of galactic conflict rolls on without pausing to notice our passing. I bear witness to this truth with every breath, every shift, every moment of continued existence in a universe that wants nothing more than to consume me and move on. The Orks took Vortan 3 and made it a hell of brutal servitude. The Imperium took it back and made it a different hell of righteous purification. And I survived both hells only to learn that there is no escape, no salvation, no hope, just the endless grinding on of history and the absolute certainty that my suffering means nothing to powers that view human life as the cheapest and most abundant resource in the galaxy. This is what happens when Orks take a planet. This is what happens when the Imperium takes it back. This is what happens to those of us caught between them. We suffer. We die. We're forgotten. And the universe continues without noticing our extinction. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and in that war, we are nothing but ammunition to be expended.